This final video discussion will have to do with relationships. It's a complicated topic, and as a result, this will be just a little bit longer than the other ones. So please stay with me as we talk through this. Unfortunately, with any relationship comes the possibility of conflicts. And when in a conflict with someone you're also in a relationship with, it gets to be complex. In a way, we think that we understand each other very well if we're in relationships, when in reality, it might be exactly the things that it turns out we didn't understand that can cause the conflicts the most. There are, though, some useful guidelines, and you could use all or some of these. Either way, they're all good ideas. First things first, in a relationship fight, things oftentimes need to cool off. It is very, very difficult to not just start a conflict, but then sort of turn a 180-degree turn and try to resolve the thing at the same time. We can become very upset. My own emotions when I'm in one of these fights tend to go from 0 to 60 very quickly, and I find that if I don't give myself a little bit of time to cool off and process what's just happened, I'm simply incapable of working to resolve whatever the conflict was. Now, well, in that resolution phase, again, after we've let ourselves cool off a bit, it's really important to use I statements. What I mean by that is that as we talk about what's happened, what the conflict was, what the conflict had to do with, and also the differences that were probably the reason that the conflict took place in the first time, we never want it to seem like we're pointing fingers as a way of continuing the fight and making our own stance known. The way of avoiding that is to use I statements or simply talk about our own experiences of all those things. If we're talking about what we have experienced, it's the best way of keeping ourselves focused on what we know and what we're able to know, as opposed to saying anything unfair about what the other person in the conflict says and knows and thinks, which we can't really know anyway. Now, number three, and this is probably the most difficult of all, we have to listen and really listen to what the other person says. More times than not, for me, this means suppressing the instinct whereby I'm thinking about how I plan to respond and maybe not listening so closely to what the other person's saying. We want to keep that down. We really do want to be able to focus well enough on what that other person is saying that we could even use what's called reflective listening and give them back after they've finished saying it what we have understood based on what they said. Once that process is done, we'll want to find a solution that satisfies you both. Maybe number three was the hardest. Number four would be the second hardest. The solution that satisfies both of you is going to be hard because of the fact that the fight started because there was something that the two people involved probably understood in radically different ways. As my wife once told me after a large fight, when I asked her, why is it that you keep saying the same thing? Her response was, well, I fight because I believe in what I think. And actually, that's a really profound truth. As difficult as it might be to get around that, though, the solution that satisfies both of the people in the conflict will be exactly the reason that another conflict like it doesn't happen, or at least doesn't happen anytime soon. Lastly, we owe each other some amount of acknowledgement of just how difficult it's been to have the fight, come through the fight, and find a way of solving the fight that satisfies you both. The step of apologizing, thanking, and forgiving is absolutely necessary, and it's going to happen after everything else. It might even have to happen after a little bit of time has passed, but it's extremely important to do. Say, though, that we're in a relationship that is happening over some amount of distance. The question becomes, well, how does one of these things work? They can. I was in a relationship like this for about a year and a half myself, and it begins and ends with the acknowledgement that both people in a long distance relationship have lives that are separate and have to be separate for some period of time. Both people have to feel able to live those lives of their own. They have to feel able to grow and change as they live their lives. The long distance relationship can never make one or both people feel bad for enjoying the lives they're living. And both people have to form other personal attachments. We can't ever be in a long distance relationship where it's only okay to be in a relationship with the person who's not there. That's just not functional. These things can work. They will be difficult. They're always difficult, but they can only work if we're giving each other the ability to live the lives they're living. Now to the fun part. I wish I weren't currently quarantining. I wish I were in classroom for these discussions. They're always more interesting that way. But to be completely honest, the fact that I'm now about to talk about human sexualities without being in the same room as all of you is just a little bit easier for me. It's important here to clarify the terminology that we're using. So I'm going to start with human sexuality itself. This is how people express themselves as human beings primarily, right? So human sexuality, the expression of oneself as a sexual human being. That is distinct from gender identity, which is how we see ourselves and our own sexuality in terms of maleness, femaleness, transgender, or non binary status. This is distinct from sexual orientation, which is a term that has specifically to do with the gender qualities of those to whom we are attracted. Lastly, there is sexual activity. This is any behavior that leads to sexual stimulation and which could carry the risk of acquiring a sexually transmitted disease. Now, rather than using the term safe sex, and I keep away from that term because it implies that any sex is completely safe, think rather of safer sex. And what this refers to is any set of actions one can take to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted disease and unwanted pregnancy. It's almost impossible to reduce these things to absolutely zero, but we can be careful and use multiple forms of safer sex to sufficiently reduce the chance of either one of these things to the point where they're no longer serious risks. Speaking of the serious risks, I invite you to take a look at Table 10.2 called Common Sexually Transmitted Infections. This is on print page 395, document page 403. Take a look at that table. Take a look at it for long enough to understand the variety of ways that one's health could suffer, and one could feel the effects of unfortunate, unthinking choices having to do with sexual relations that could really affect us for the long term and possibly keep us from ever being completely healthy again. For avoiding these things entirely, the first guideline that the book gives, and frankly, the first one that I have to acknowledge, even though I don't really believe in it, is abstinence. I grew up during a period when, as a young Catholic, and even someone who was in, middle school in the mid 90s, abstinence was still the thing that people like to talk about the most as the best way of avoiding STIs. But if we're truly practicing abstinence, then really it was never a danger to begin with because we're not having sex. And so, it's almost a foregone conclusion then that really we're not needing to be concerned in that way because abstinence means we're abstaining. So I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, maybe we haven't gotten to that point in our lives. Maybe we're not actually having sex yet. And in that way, fine. Abstinence is keeping us safe. But the moment we become sexual human beings is the moment that abstinence sort of stops mattering that much. After that, we have disclosure. In other words, a frank and honest conversation between two or more people, if need be, I suppose, that are having sexual relations in which one discloses to the other exactly what their past experiences have been, what the likelihood of any sexually transmitted infections might be, and anything else the other partner might need to know so that the other partner is prepared for any complications that could go along with sex. This right now is happening in the context of STIs. Again, these are sexually transmitted infections, but quite frankly, it could also have to do with pregnancy. One of the things that would have to happen during disclosure would be both parties understanding whatever contraception is or isn't being used by the other. The next guideline for protecting oneself against STIs is to have one partner long term. Of course, at the beginning, we would have the conversation with that partner about our previous experiences. But if we are truly with one partner long term or monogamous, This means that we know everything they've done and they know everything we've done by default. Condom usage is always advisable, particularly a latex condom, rather than any of the other alternatives, which are less proven to avoid these things. And finally, if we are in any sexual relationships with multiple people, we need to be proactive about it and we need to get checked by our healthcare provider on a regular basis. Again, the other consideration to make here is avoiding unwanted pregnancy. Most contraception in this is done by the female. I'd imagine you've heard this in a few different times already. I think probably we've all had a couple of different health classes. There's one exception, and there's one exception that more and more men are choosing as time goes on, and this is vasectomy. It might be at the end of having kids. Alternatively, if a male has simply decided that he does not want to be father to children, he could have it at the beginning of a relationship or any time in between. Just though, as avoiding STIs meant using two or more forms of protection. Excuse me, please. The same thing goes here. The best way to avoid unintended pregnancy is to use two or more forms of contraception at a time. It seems, and this is due to the negative reality that lots of sexual assaults and rapes happen on campus, that any discussion of these things has to also do with sexual assault and rape and how to understand it. About a third of all dating relationships involve some physical violence. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 10 men will be sexually assaulted in their lifetimes, often during the time that they are in college on a college campus. About a fourth of sexual assault victims are in the typical college age range of 18 to 24 years old. As many as 1 in 4 women experience unwanted sexual intercourse while attending college. In more than 3/4 of rape cases, the victim knows the perpetrator. The most important and best way of avoiding these things, specifically of avoiding the possibility of sexual assault or rape, is to understand the principle of affirmative consent. Now, I'll make these notes available to you so you can get to this link. Otherwise, simply go to Google and type in the words affirmative to consent, T consent. It'll take you to a video, watch it. You'll understand exactly what this principle is. It is the best single guideline for making sure that the expectations of sexual activity, sexual contact, and whether or not both parties are actually able to agree to it are clear. Please watch this, make sure you understand it. More now than ever, males, females, anyone else, binary, non binary, you name it, everybody needs to understand the principle of affirmative consent. So please look it up, watch the video. Thank you.